return to Plato for a topic like love. Love in particular actually initially gives us the impression that it is ahistorical and wouldn't really change over time. But we have learned from Claire's presentation that it does have a history. And if it does, then Plato seems quite far removed from us. So I would like to say a little bit about the idea of history that is at stake in returning us to Plato. Philosophers have thought quite a bit about history, and I cannot speak about that in detail here. If you want a bit more detail, there's actually a text on the webpage. But just something to think about how history can be thought of. We believe that the kinds of events that happen in history are not disconnected. There seem to be connections between the kinds of things that I believe we could quite nicely call a historical world. Now, there can, of course, be connections by way of really radical transformations and changes and even revolutions. So one historical world can look really quite different from the previous one, but it would nonetheless be a kind of response to that. And if there are these connections, well, I mean, on the one hand, one would be inclined to think a little bit more about actually what sort of makes a historical world. And then we would probably be reflecting on the sort of ideas and convictions, customs, habits, hopes, fears that concern a particular culture at a particular time. And when it then comes to something like the Platonic times, the interesting bit there is that this really returns us to the origins of our Western history, especially as far as a kind of philosophical history is concerned, but also even in general a history of reflecting on things and of just not taking the world for granted, so to speak. And the idea there is that if love has certain problems that are really peculiar to it, that are at its core or part of its essence, then we would already find those in Plato. And in fact, the very concept of Platonic love actually makes us aware that there seems to be a problem there already for Plato that surrounds love, and that appears to have driven him to problematize sexuality and to suggest to us that a purely Platonic love would perhaps be the way to go to avoid certain dangers of love. But it turns out that the concept of Platonic love is more complicated and is certainly worth looking into. And again, the idea being that it returns us to the very origins of what has then become the entire history of Western love by way of romantic love or erotic love, as it has come down to us to the 20th and 21st century. If we go to the Platonic dialogues, we find quite a lot of utterances about love. And it's already quite astounding that we actually have two dialogues that are devoted to the topic of love, the Symposium and the Phaedrus, and then a number of other dialogues that touch on love. And in the dialogues in general, we find creatures with a body having these philosophical conversations. So we already have, in a sense, more of the human embodied nature in those dialogues than we have in a number of other philosophical treatises. Furthermore, we actually find these human beings, these interlocutors in the dialogues, a lot of times engaged in flirtation with each other. There's quite a lot of flirtatious behavior going on if one looks more closely. And also indeed reflections on the body and on the place of the body in nature that undermine the kind of traditional Platonic idea that Plato is hostile to the body. So there are quite a number of passages that point the other way. And also explicit statements about love. So if we turn to the Phaedrus, for example, there is clearly a distinction there between something that Socrates presents as a more philosophical kind of love, where the sexual component isn't as central, and then there is a less philosophical idea of love where the sexual activity is less constrained. But even for the philosophical kind of love, sexual activity is by no means ruled out. We have a citation where Socrates says something quite explicitly along those lines.
When they are in bed, the lover's undisciplined horse has a word to say to the charioteer that, after all its sufferings, it is entitled to a little fun.
We find that even when it comes to the non-philosophical kind of love, Socrates still points out that it's superior to a kind of human self-control in such a way that he thinks that love in general is a gift from the gods and is ultimately something to be cherished.
These are the rewards you will have from a lover's friendship, my boy, and they are as great as divine gifts should be. A non-lover's companionship, on the other hand, is diluted by human self-control. All it pays are cheap human dividends.
There clearly are quite a number of challenging and problematic aspects of love, and this idea of Platonic love doesn't come out of nowhere. At the beginning of the Republic, we have a statement about the kinds of sexual pleasures and their relationship to other pleasures.
Socrates, can you think of a greater or keener pleasure than sexual pleasure? Glaucon, I can't, or a madder one either.
So keeping this in mind, it makes sense to impose some rules and regulations on sexual activity and not just let people go about their pleasures as they want with anybody they want at all times. There can even be something emancipating about a reminder in the Platonic dialogues that there shouldn't be an impression that one always has to give in to somebody who wants to invite sexual activity. And that is indeed something that we also see happening in one of the dialogues in the Symposium, when famously Alcibiades tries to seduce Socrates but is actually turned down by Socrates, which is presumably one of the arguments that people use for their asexual concept of Platonic love. But at the same time, the come on as we find it presented there by Alcibiades is so crude that it can also just be a reminder that there are different kinds of love and different kinds of thinking about the relationship between love and sexuality in such a way that they come together more harmoniously and wouldn't have to have this aspect where sexuality is the thing that starts the relationship off. The dangers of love also include the fact that love has this aspect of exclusivity to it, where really the focus goes to this one other person that one is in love with. And there's a passage in the Platonic dialogues that is a little bit amusing, perhaps even in relationship to that, namely in the Symposium, where we get informed that initially we find just one body beautiful, and then we realize that there are actually lots and lots of beautiful bodies, and that beauty is something that extends beyond this one human being that we are in love with. So initially that could seem like an invitation to promiscuity, but it doesn't seem that that's what's really meant here, but more the kind of idea that seeing something beautiful, seeing something lovable in one human being can also make us in general more harmoniously attuned with what it is to be human and can ultimately make us better human creatures. But on the other hand, there is also the danger that it distracts us from our obligations, for example, from our ethical and political obligations. And that would be the kind of thing that, on the one hand, Plato is very worried about, but also something that still extends actually into the 20th century and makes the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas point out that love can function kind of like a dual egoism, where the couple just becomes this kind of entity that closes itself off from the rest of the world. And that, of course, can indeed have problematic implications for one's other obligations towards oneself and society at large, and furthering one's life obligations and possibilities. According to Plato, love can even bring us into philosophy. And that is at the same time, then again, one of the moments that leads some people to presume that Platonic love is aphysical, purely intellectual love. But if one looks into the matter more closely, love actually reveals something very important about how we exist as human beings, because it is really part of our nature that we are kind of creatures of the between. This notion of the between is quite important in the Platonic dialogues when it comes to love, because it's this between movement that actually allows the desire to continue, and indeed continue as a movement rather than finding a closure point or a point of arrival. And when it comes to us human beings, then we are really in between quite a number of dimensions. We are between materiality and spirituality. We are between past and future. We are between the sexes. And at the same time, we find the between space quite uncomfortable. We a lot of times desire something much more firm and stable and univocal to hold on to, especially also in matters of love, because it turns out that it's actually one of the definitional characteristics of love that it wants to possess the good and hold on to it forever.
Love is wanting to possess the good forever.
That would be one of the factors behind marriage, that once we have found a good thing, we want to try and make sure that it is indeed ours forever and ever. But that might potentially not be in line with the nature of love, nor even with the nature of who we are and how we exist as human beings. So as a kind of reminder to cherish the between space, I would like to invoke Luz Irigaray, who writes, "Everything is always in movement, in a state of becoming, and the mediator of all this is, among other things, or exemplarily, love, never fulfilled, always becoming." This last bit would be the characterization of desire, namely that desire, unlike some kind of physical need, will not ever be fulfilled, but will actually continue and only become deeper over time.